Hello, everyone. I can see that the number of attendees is increasing really rapidly. So we are going to give a couple of minutes for people to join us. But we have a very full panel, so we are only going to give 1 more minute and then we will be started. So let me greet everyone. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or good night, depending on where you are. And welcome to our high-level political forum site event. My name is Maria Balsera, and I'm the Tax and Education Alliance Coordinator. I'm going to be chairing this excellent panel on tax, austerity, and debt, how to manage the SDG4, which is on education, and other gender-responsive public services. As we know, 20 years after the first international conference on financing for development in Monterrey, the effects of COVID-19 and the war in Ukraine threaten to derail the progress made in these 2 decades, resulting in hundreds of millions of people falling back into extreme poverty and a growing backlog in the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Following years of austerity policies, public services, particularly education and health, faced a devastating crisis in financing even before COVID. The cumulative effect of high levels of debt servicing, public sector wage bill constraints, regressive tax systems, illicit financial flows, economic impacts of the pandemic, increased climate-related emergencies, and inflation in food and fuel prices all disproportionately affect women and girls. To address this, we need bold new strategies and actions to ensure adequate financing for the Sustainable Development Goals. The present global financial and tax architecture is regressive, gender-biased, and inadequate to deliver the 2030 agenda. And that's why this panel aims to shed light on the power dynamics and structures that shape the present and unequal distribution of wealth and resources, to reimagine a financing and tax architecture that would promote redistribution, gender equality, and accelerated progress on education and other public services that are key to achieve the SDGs, and to propose actionable solutions to strengthen domestic resource mobilization, including through reforms to international systems. We have a very big panel, and unfortunately, we won't be having much time in terms of a Q&A session, but I would like to encourage you to use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen to ask your questions, and if you could direct them to specific speakers, then hopefully they will be able to reply to you, typing them. So to cover these big topics and big issues, we have brought together this panel with a great array of speakers who will be offering solutions for fixing the global financing architecture promoting the SDGs. The first speaker doesn't really need an introduction, and if I were to do justice to everything that she has done, we wouldn't have time to do anything else. So please let me give the floor to Professor Attiya Waris, the independent expert on debt and other financial obligations and human rights. Attiya, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Maria. You're very sweet. Good evening, everybody, from a very cold Nairobi. It's a pleasure to be here. I have been watching the conversations going on, and I must say that I'm getting some heart out of it. And I hope that this will be another conversation to add in a positive direction that we can now encourage the high-level panel to take. There are 2 aspects which I will talk about, and I usually say them as one specific phrase. I talk about rights requiring resources. And of course, when we talk about education and gender, those are rights that require resources, But those are also areas where affirmative action has now started to make positive steps forward. But when it comes to education, we haven't quite reached the mark yet. But it is now a more nuanced debate when you link education with gender and then make that further step onto the other side where the resource link is put into place. So we all know that we're living in a time of multiple crises, and unfortunately data is showing that during COVID, the informal sector was hit the most in most parts of the world, and women tend to be in the informal sector. We also got to hear from data presented in some of the panels today that when you're looking at formalizing the economy, the women do tend to get left behind across the board. And these are broad sweeping statements, some of which were coming out of the ILO today. So there is an urgent need for countries to strengthen their fiscal systems, because if we don't set into place the resources to support women and to support the education system, then we will not move populations forward, we will not raise living standards, and we will not reduce discrimination. And why do I make this sort of broad statement? Well, I make it because that is the problem in the education sector right now. We see more and more women at lower levels and less women at higher levels. And this needs to also start to change. And when we move people into the workplace, the fact that the informal sector is dominated by women has also got a lot to do with the fact that many women have not received the same access to education and therefore are resorting to the informal sector in order to earn a living and support themselves. So these interconnections, as you start to look at them at a granular level, at domestic level, starts to show itself. And unfortunately, not enough women in international spaces. If we look at lower levels of education, basic education, the girl child is present, the balancing is coming about. When you look at the number of teachers in universities, that is not as strong when it comes to gender basis. So these are dynamics that are now showing themselves better and better. And the data is getting better, but the data is not yet good enough and it's not yet clear enough. So this is another thing that continues to be a problem. So there is an urgent need for us to look at how we are taking on financial systems, how we are putting in place financing mechanisms, but also in so many different areas. And my mandate covers debt, and in that I include private and public debt. Both those need equal attention. And when it comes to international financial obligations, it needs not only taxation, it needs illicit financial flows. We need to look at other government revenue, we need to look at business transactions, we need to get government business. So there are many layers to the resources, and all of these feed into the global financial framework in different ways. And one of the things that I have been doing through my mandate is communicating to different international institutions. Recently, as a team with the expert on poverty development, as well as the working group on discrimination against women, we sent a letter to the IMF acknowledging their efforts. This was in March this year, pointing towards the institution's regrettable participation in austerity measures and how this has affected public investment in areas of particular concern for women and girls. Now, these austerity measures that we refer to really are affecting social housing, it is affecting shelter to escape domestic violence, and it is exacerbating the constraints that women are facing for autonomy. And I'm happy to put into the chat box later the link to these letters. And I must say that each and every policy, strategy, and operation of the IMF should be gender responsive. And this is what we've asked them to do. We have to date not received, unfortunately, a response to this. But we also went a step forward and we sent a letter to the OECD, to which we did receive a response as regards the European Union, the OECD BEPS two-pillar solution, which is pretty infamous or famous, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. But we did ask them about the weakening of their capacity to fulfill human rights obligations. And having had a reflection and look at OECD documentation very recently, I noticed that there isn't an OECD position on tax and human rights. And this is something that is a big gap, and I think it's something they need to fill in. And it's part of what I will be putting in my report to the General Assembly in October this year. Now, this particular letter to the IMF, I hope will get some response, but we are waiting for it. Now, I want to end on two specific points. First is my General Assembly report. I think that we have a real problem with the issues of international tax governance. I think that countries are facing cumulative dangers. I keep thinking of those cumulonimbus clouds, that always feel so big and amorphous and hanging everywhere with clouds of black and white in them. That's what it feels like to me. There's high debt-related distress right now. Illicit financial flows are not being controlled. And then we are having severe socioeconomic impacts from the pandemic, as well as an increase in climate-related emergencies and the layer of food inflation. And these are the global issues. Regional issues include an increase in wars, an increase in humanitarian crises. And I think it's really important we keep that in mind. Now, I would like to point out that a previous mandate holder did write a report on the measures of women, including a discussion on unpaid care work, a very important issue. And being able to measure unpaid care work in this time of fiscal crisis is now, I think, absolutely mandatory. I think moving an economy forward and leaving this out of the measurement system is a big mistake if we continue this way. And we do need to open this up. I'm going to stop there because I really want to hear the rest of the panel, but thank you so much for your attention. Maria.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Attiya. What a powerful beginning of this panel. Thank you very much. So now, without much further ado, I'm going to ask Caroline Othim from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice to talk. And unfortunately, she might not be able to switch her camera on because of connectivity problems. But Caroline, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was quite a powerful opening by Professor Attiya Waris. And I'm happy to take from where she stopped. And my sharing today is going to focus more on framing of the taxation system in a manner that it's feminist to ensure that we contribute towards achieving SDG number 4 on education. So, and also link it to SDG number 5 on achieving gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So when you look at this SDGs, gender equality and empowerment of women and girls is a very integral dimension of sustainable development, and all the SDGs actually depend on the achievement of goal number 5 on gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. So this is a very important goal that cuts across all the SDGs and therefore really needs to have the pride of place. So in regard to gender equality and tax justice, and to build on the points that have been raised by Professor Attiya, we've seen in the recent past that an increasing attention is focused on how tax laws and policies continue to shape women's lives, continue to shape how women access property, their incomes, and even in terms of public service provision, including education. So really, the SDGs as a commitment by world leaders to resourcing women's rights is a very important instrument. And one of the elements that this can be realized is through taxation for gender equality, so that we are able to advance substantive gender equality in all aspects of taxation, of expenditures, and even in terms of the other fiscal laws. And this is enshrined in a number of instruments and frameworks, including, for instance, the CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We have several regional instruments in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and even in the Americas. You know, these human rights covenants that really go a long way towards achieving substantive gender equality. And of course, even at the national level, we have constitutional provisions, as well as provisions in other laws of different countries at the domestic level. So all these really serve towards ensuring that leaders are committed towards delivering gender equality. And so the attention that I'm talking about towards the gender impact of tax laws really has been accelerated by some very important happenings in the recent past, in terms of looking at the public finance policy frameworks. So we've seen in the recent past a focus on tax and spending cuts, to stimulate economic growth. We also saw in 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis, which many countries responded in terms of cutting back on spending and other measures. And we are also seeing an increased focus on fiscal consolidation and privatization of public services, including, education. And when these public services are privatized, women really do not get to benefit because of the measures that are put in place. So we are also seeing income inequalities, and this has also been highlighted through the COVID-19 pandemic, which has triggered quite a number of multiple crises, as been mentioned by Attiya as well. We have the climate emergency. We are also witnessing corporate abuse and other forms of impunity. So all this really has drawn an attention to the gender impact of tax and budgetary policies. And therefore, it's really important for us to really look at these elements. And to build on the points around unpaid care work, clearly we see the pandemic exposing the need for us to shift the discourse from the care economy to the social organization of care. There's really a need for us to rebuild the social organization of care and looking at the 5R framework. So in terms of recognizing the economic value of care work, and care as a human right, rewarding decent work and social protection, reducing the burden of unpaid care work on women, redistributing care work between the state and households, and lastly, in terms of reclaiming the public nature of care services and it being the main responsibility of states in terms of financing and providing universal access to these care services. We also see in terms of tax systems heavily relying on regressive taxes such as VAT and excise taxes on fuel and other household necessities, which really are burdensome for women and other marginalized sectors. And therefore, it's really important, and we believe that gender biases and other discriminatory policies in the tax and fiscal systems must be removed or corrected before taxation can really be considered as a tool for advancing gender justice and to reduce inequalities. And because gender equality by 2030, going by the SDGs, really requires an urgent action to eliminate the root causes of discrimination that still curtail women's rights privates, both in public and private spheres. So really there needs to be a reform of the international financial architecture, and for a feminist taxation system, it would be important to look at 5 key elements. And one of them is in terms of curbing of tax abuses and illicit financial flows by multinational corporations and the wealthy elites, and to ensure that there's an establishment of a global tax body to ensure that all countries can be able to participate on an equal footing in decision-making on global tax rules. And this global tax body would be able to deliver effective global solutions to international tax dodging and to really reinforce the international commitments to achieve gender equality, including through progressive and gender just tax policies. And number 2 element is in terms of reducing or eliminating the unfair tax burdens on women. And in a world where regressive tax policies have become a very convenient option by many governments to raise domestic revenues, instead of prioritizing and emphasizing on progressive tax measures, really important for us to ensure that there's a reduction on these unfair tax burdens on women, because these policies negatively impact on poor women, particularly women living in poverty and from developing countries. So it's really important for us to look into this, because when women really continue to feel the pinch and to, you know, be disproportionately affected by these regressive taxes. Number 3 is in terms of gender bias that we see in so many tax systems, so both implicitly and explicitly. So important to also address that. And number 4 element is in terms of the unpaid care work being recognized, being rewarded, to be reduced, to be redistributed, and to be reclaimed as a public good. And the 5th area for reforms would be in terms of ensuring that there's enough tax revenues for gender responsive public services. And of course, this can also be done through gender budgeting. And to conclude, Maria, because I know I'm running out of time, I just want to say that we continually see women being impacted by the current global economic and tax system. They continue to be paid less, so there's a big gender pay gap. Women own much less assets, they do more unpaid care work, and they also live below the poverty line. And so it's really high time, in the context of the pandemic, for governments to institute transformative reforms. And for a just and transformative recovery, it's important for progressive tax and fiscal policies to be in place to ensure that gender equality and women's rights is something that is a reality for all, and that we put people and the planet first over profit. Thank you, Maria. I hand it back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Caroline, for bringing this really powerful gender analysis to taxation and to how to fix the economy. Definitely really good. And now we are going to be having Liz Nelson from Tax Justice Network, who will be talking about the impact of global tax abuse on financing SDG4 and other SDGs. Liz, over to you.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks to Caroline. That was just a really brilliant and comprehensive run through of so many complex issues. So I might repeat some of those things, or I'll try and weed out so I don't repeat too much. But I think I wanted to just, in the time I've got, talk about the importance of revenue, the importance of the interconnection between the national and the international in terms of around tax abuse and illicit financial flows, and also the connection, the two sides of the coin of tax abuse and financial secrecy, and how all those impact on SDG4. So kind of first of all, it's really about to say that the ability of states to function effectively and to fulfill their commitment to SDG4 and actually all the sustainable development goals is related to that, the guarantee of rights both to their citizens and to people in other neighbouring jurisdictions. All that is really dependent on the availability of revenue, and without revenue, human development is undermined, it cannot flourish, nor can rights be guaranteed. And so that's a really, I think, one of the kind of key first points that I wanted to make. Tax revenue is by far the most sustainable source of revenue necessary to ensure that development and to support SDG4 and education. And because education is an investment in society's future, the failure to protect or respect that right to education, to meet that commitment, to be complicit in facilitating tax abuse, whether you're a wealthy individual, a government, an enabler, a professional accountant or lawyer, regardless of that, what you do is an attack on a society that might otherwise flourish. And so education is obviously something that Caroline's talked about, essential for ending multiple forms of discrimination, especially against women and girls, and those overlapping identities. Education is still gender biased, the biases between rural and urban education, and together all these generate overlapping and intersectional inequalities. So how do we address this, and what's really is the impact of tax abuse and illicit financial flows? The UN speaks of 20 years of progress in education being wiped out by COVID-19, but pre-COVID, many lower income countries or lower middle income countries were not reaching the SDG benchmark of 20% share of budget or 46% of GDP allocated to education. So where was that going? What was draining the public revenue budgets? And why does that kind of impact on education? Well, I think others have covered that and will cover that in terms of, you know, availability of funding per child, whether it's for desks and chairs and so on. So I won't go into too much detail. I just wanted to focus now a bit on the scale of tax losses, of illicit financial flows. And I want to use estimates that Tax Justice Network has produced. There are other estimates, and I think the key thing is they are estimates, and that's the real nub of it. They're estimates because we don't know, because we don't have the data. I think Attiya mentioned that there's in a whole raft of different ways, the lack of data, the lack of public data that's accessible prevents a level of accountability and integrity in what's being done. But we are getting better at estimates, and we've in 2020, the global kind of profit shifting and tax evasion was $427 billion. In 2021, it was $483 billion. So, and of the 427 in 2020, 182 billion of that was down to wealthy individuals hiding undeclared assets or incomes offshore. So, if you like, beyond the reach of the law that you and I abide by. So it's a key issue for financing SDG is that relationship between tax abuse at the domestic level and at the international level, because the longer we allow financial secrecy to continue with impunity, tax abuse to continue and operate with impunity through secretive channels, that gives much less space and much less opportunity for governments to raise their own domestic revenue and to determine their taxing rights and their future, and the opportunity to finance education or other public services in the way that they want to and their citizens want to. So I just want to talk about some of the solutions very quickly, and come back to a key point which both Attiya and Caroline have mentioned. Fairly long established now with, we've talked about, to address the financial transparency and tax abuse issues, a policy platform which we abbreviate to the ABC policy platform. It has 3 elements. One is about exchanging, the automatic exchange of information between jurisdictions. Again, this is a big issue around data and statistics, and making that available, putting it in the public domain, and enabling competent authorities in different jurisdictions to understand who's evading tax and what's happening with illicit financial flows. So that's the first thing, automatic information exchange. We need that multilaterally to be operating. We also need beneficial ownership registers, so that we know who is the real beneficial ownership for companies, for trusts, for foundations, for partnerships. Where are the wealth and the assets? So that we can address tax abuse, we understand where the drain on domestic revenue is happening. And to add to that, in those public registers, it brings again a level of accountability, but it has to be multilateral. Everyone has to be doing it. And one of the greatest, while the ABC platform has been established, there's certainly been a consensus for a while, partial implementation tends to benefit wealthy countries, not the low-income countries. So the final one I wanted to mention, the country-by-country reporting, which is important because that's actually helped us with the estimates I've just mentioned. And this is about getting multinational corporations to publicly make available their accounting reports on a country-by-country basis, so that they don't pretend that there are lots of different companies unrelated. The ones that are related, we get that information in the public domain. And what connects these points together is they undermine the adequate and agreed financing for education and other SDGs in terms of that international tax arrangements. So that, and they generate inequalities in taxing rights both between countries and give rise to failures to achieve those SDGs. Now, the kind of, I suppose the final thing, and it is very connected to those, that connection between national and international. It's connected around issues of taxing rights and who decides the taxing rules. Today, there have been recently in the last several years attempts to reform the tax rules, the tax governance, and this has been done through the OECD. It's the ambition of that project in its different parts has largely not been delivered, and would say has failed. And so what we're left with is, I think what it kind of almost boils down to is the issue of governance, and the issue of governance of international tax, which impacts the ability of countries to raise revenues, to finance properly quality education, really comes down to the institutions that sets the rules. The problem with international governance is that it's characterized at the moment by institutions that are neither inclusive nor effective in addressing those challenges of international tax abuse and illicit financial flows. And it's not enough to reform without assessing the impact of cross-cutting inequalities and the impact on lower income countries and middle income countries, as well as high income countries. It can't be business as usual for global north jurisdictions, institutions. There needs to be a different approach. And the tax justice movement, and I think Caroline's already mentioned this, if we're serious about the commitment to SDGs and SDG4 in particular, every effort really needs to be targeted on bringing proposals to move the governance of international tax under the auspices of the United Nations, where it can be multilateral, intergovernmental, inclusive, and the reforms need to reverse practices and take a progressive approach and an inclusive approach to the right to the education raising revenue and to providing the tools whereby different jurisdictions can do that. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was a great presentation as well. And just to show how we really need proper solutions to make these progressive reforms more inclusive and progressive and transparent. And for that, we really need the UN, as you said, and not the OECD, who is just pushing for the rich countries' interests more than anything else. So thank you very much. And without much further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Bernadette O'Hare, who will be talking about the tax caps and the importance of policy coherence to finance the SDGs. So Bernie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Can I check you can see my screen, Maria? And you can hear me okay? Yeah, thank you. So good morning, afternoon and evening, everybody. And I'm just going to speak to tax gaps and the importance of policy coherence to finance the SDGs, or fundamental economic and social human rights. Globally, as we know, we're experiencing multiple overlapping crises, and many of them are human-made, people-made. And we know there's already limited fiscal space in government's budgets for public services, for public sector workers, including education and teachers, without all of these additional challenges. If we think about government revenue, and we've heard that 70% of government revenue comes from taxation. This can be domestic or it can be international. And there's only so much space within the domestic arena to increase domestic taxation. And some experts have said that the most feasible way to increase government revenue in lower income countries is in the international arena. So, for example, reducing international corporate tax abuse, etc. Now, if governments had more revenue, we know they spend more on human rights, the SDGs. They'll spend more on schools, they'll spend more on healthcare. We also know that when governments have more revenue, there's actually an improvement in governance. And that results in economic growth, it results in better allocation decisions, and it results in improved efficiency of spending. But probably the most important aspect of revenue is not only what it can buy to fund public services, but the effect it has on redistribution. It curbs inequalities between and within individuals. It can be used to reprice, for example, to limit health damage in products, which is important for health. The other important aspect of government revenue, we know that countries that rely on tax revenues have higher quality of governance. So an increase in government revenue can lead to a virtuous circle, which will all result in more spending on the SDGs, including education. So it's absolutely critical that we focus on this. This slide is just to show us the impact of an increase in government revenue, and it's shown on the horizontal axis per capita revenue. The vertical axis shows coverage, in this case, of basic water. So we see that when governments have more revenue, and the solid line shows countries with sort of poorer governance, there's very little increase, or there's little increase in coverage of basic water. However, in countries that are well governed, this has a very significant impact. So a small increase in revenue can have a very significant impact on human rights. And this is across many of the SDGs. However, as we know, there are losses from government revenue, and the one that I'm talking about today is tax losses, be it domestic or international. And when governments don't have enough revenue, they rely on debt, and as we know, this can increase dramatically. So it could be that if we could curtail tax losses, we could curtail other losses and drive a virtuous circle. This slide just shows us revenue losses according to the region on the bottom, and we see the average tax abuse as a percentage of government revenue in the black here. And when we compare it with the average external debt loss as a percentage of government revenue, we see the debt, generally speaking, is larger than the tax losses. However, when we add these together, we see that many governments, this is on average, many governments are losing a sizable chunk of their revenue to these losses, be it tax abuse or regular debt service every year. And this is resources that could be spent on the SDGs, on teachers, on schools. And Liz mentioned this. We know that there's large amounts, or our estimates from the State of Tax Justice, so there's large amounts of losses as a result of tax abuse. And the same report also estimates that, you know, more than half of this has been attributed to the rules and regulations of a small number of countries. And when we looked at this graph on your right, and we look at the revenue losses compared to the ODA from all development assistant countries, we see that revenue losses can often be more than ODA. When we compare it to the ODA from the 4 countries mentioned in that report, we see that it completely dwarfs the ODA from those 4 countries. So policy coherence for sustainable development requires a holistic evaluation of all national policies, including the tax policy. And donor countries in particular need to review their national tax policies to identify possible spillover effects. And we've heard about the ABC, and other things they could do is review their double taxation treaties. Comments from the human rights committees have mentioned this, particularly with regards to the 4 countries mentioned, CEDAW in 2019 and the UNCRC in 2022 asked the state parties to review their policies to see if there was having any negative impact on the rights of women and children in other countries. And just focusing in on 7 countries, in 7 countries, we see that revenue loss often outweighs ODA in many countries. We see here in Zambia and Ghana, Senegal, that revenue loss is more than ODA. And when we look at ODA just from the 4 countries that we are believed to enable a lot of tax abuse, we see that it completely dwarfs the ODA from those countries. And on the right, we've divided it up according to the different countries, and it really hardly even is shown for some of the ODA from some of those countries. On the other side of the coin, if we think what we could do with the extra money, so what if governments had more money equivalent to that loss? And this is using an econometric model and looking at one country, and I've picked 25% because that was the average for the region of Africa. And we see, you know, hundreds of thousands more children would spend another year in school. So this could have a massive impact on development. So in terms of solutions, we've heard the UN, for example, in 2015, the Mbeki panel in 2015 mentioned that the UN process and framework would be an ideal forum for international tax cooperation. And then more recently, the FACTI panel has said one of their key recommendations is the creation of a fair mechanism to arbitrate international tax disputes under a UN tax convention. And even more recently, the African group of finance ministers have made this statement. The African group strongly believe the urgent need to establish a universal UN international intergovernmental tax body. And I've just put up this database, which is really useful to know. It lists all the interventions by different countries and groups in terms of their support for this move. And this slide is just to show us one sort of proposal made to the UN General Assembly, and was made by G77 in China. And the proposal was the promotion of international cooperation to combat illicit financial flows and strengthen good practices on asset returns to foster sustainable development. And I think it's interesting to look at the voting record for and against these proposals. And it's interesting to see that the 4 countries that I mentioned earlier have actually voted against this proposal. They voted no. And there was also 7 abstainers. So this is the sort of thing we need to have a think about from an advocacy perspective, and depending, of course, where we live. So finally, if we think about policy coherence for sustainable development from a perspective of a high-income country, at a global level, we can support calls for the creation of a fair mechanism to arbitrate international tax disputes. At a national level, we can review our national tax policies and administrative practices to identify negative spillover effects using the framework of ABC and reviewing tax treaties. So thank you very much for your time.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Bernadette O'Hare, for these striking statistics. Really powerful. And now it's the turn for me to be sharing my slides. So I get to be the chair and presenter. So I hope that people can also keep me on time, because we all have 10 minutes for our presentations. And I will be talking to you about the progress towards the SDG4 in education and how to address the financing gap. As I said before, I am the coordinator of the Tax and Education Alliance, and this is an alliance that brings together Tax Justice Network, Global Alliance for Tax Justice, ActionAid, Education International, and the Global Campaign for Education. And we are also partnering with the University of St. Andrews and GREAT that Bernie was representing. So I really like this cartoon. I'm not going to read it for you, but this is something that last week at the Transforming Education Pre-Summit, I showed a couple of ministers of education, including Senge from Sierra Leone, and he really felt very identified with this. And I think that many of them do. So for the SDG4 in 2015, and for all the Sustainable Development Goals, government committed to delivering equitable, inclusive, and quality education for all by 2030. I'm afraid to tell you that we are really far from actually meeting this goal, with only 8 years to go. Why is that? Well, one of the underlying reasons is that even before COVID-19, there was a chronic underfunding of education. The education budget back then, the average was around 17% of the government budget in low-income countries, and this doesn't meet the recommended benchmark of 20%. The recommended benchmark of the GDP that should be allocated to education is 6%, and the average was 3.4%. But this hides some huge disparities in many countries that are getting a lot less than this percentage, and some of them are allocating over 20%. So it also hides some huge disparities in education spending, particularly in terms of the government expenditure per capita, and you can see more on this table on my right here on the in yellow of how much countries are spending per student. And you can see that in low-income countries, what we see is that the household expenditure on education is much higher than in high-income countries, even when they are much poorer, right? So we can see the unfairness of it all. We also saw that public sector wage bills constraints, together with austerity, have been really taking a massive effect in terms of the education quality, and particularly in terms of the shortage of teachers. Back then, there was a growing teacher gap of estimated to be 69 million teachers needed to actually meet the targets. So for that, what we really need, and what the previous presenters have been raising, is this domestic resource mobilization. And already the Education Commission flagged that the domestic resource mobilization should be 97% of the current financing gap, and only 3% should be coming from aid or loans. However, most of the discussions, particularly at the high-level political forum and the Transforming Education Summit and everywhere else, seems to be on this 3% rather than this 97% that needs to be coming from domestic resource mobilization, and as it was discussed before, should be coming from progressive taxation, right? We have already debt servicing was a big problem, and debt repayment services, when they were more than 12% of the budget, we saw that that had a really negative effect on the amount of money that they could spend on public services such as education or health. And we saw that there was a raising household cost of people spending more money on education. This is due to privatization, to cost sharing, leading to exclusion and stratification. We know that when education is not free, it really prevents lots of people, particularly those that are more marginalized, particularly girls and women, from accessing education. So if things were bad before COVID, things have really got worse. The COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted many of these shortcomings and inequalities. And we have seen that 2/3 of low-income countries and lower middle-income countries have cut their education budgets. We have seen that the government revenues have been falling, and that other public services, and particularly health and safety nets, have been prioritized. We have seen increasing levels of debt and poverty, and this is at a time that we need extra resources to make sure that everyone comes back. And we know that otherwise, lots of people, like children, will never go back to education. So for a really long time, we have been looking at the share of the budget, and this is the benchmarks that we were talking before, which is the minimum is supposed to be between 15 and 20%, but really 20% for low and lower middle income countries. What we see in this graph is that things have really got worse over time. And Bernie was mentioning before in terms of the human rights law, and the states have this obligation to allocate the maximum available resources, right? And they also have an obligation not to take retrogressive steps, so steps back. So all these countries to really justify why they have been allocating a lower proportion of the education budget, of the government budget, to education. But just things as they are, you can see here that neither of these countries, these 6 countries, actually meet the 20% benchmark. In fact, Uganda, Zambia, and Nepal, like they don't even reach this, there is 13.2 for Nepal, and in Uganda, Zambia is just over 11%, which is really, really inadequate. So reaching the SDG4 will require governments to grow their budgets overall. So even those who were closer and sometimes surpassing the 20% benchmark, they didn't have enough. And for far too long, we have been focusing on the share of the budget. This is very important and something that we should keep advocating on, to make sure that the government uses 20% of the government budget, but they cannot be increasing it forever. What we need to be doing is to increase the size of the government revenues overall, and this is something that the previous speaker have already covered. And this has to be done through progressive taxation, particularly. But we also need to be focusing on the other 2 S's, and one of them is the sensitivity of the allocation within education, particularly focusing on equity, making sure that the budgets are gender and inclusive, that they are gender transformative or gender responsive, right? We also need to ensure scrutiny, because this is needed to ensure that the money arrives in practice. And for that, we need to raise awareness and strengthen the capacity in terms of budget tracking, especially in disadvantaged areas. So what do we need to be looking particularly as how to increase the size of the budget? I'm not going to go into detail, but we have the financing, the SDG4 fact sheets for the 6 countries I'm going to be covering here, and another 4 countries. So we have them on the ActionAid website, which is here below, for Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, Nepal, Zambia, and Senegal, which are the most recent, but also for Malawi, Mozambique, Nigeria, and Tanzania. So this actually compares what the estimated tax incentives, harmful tax incentives given in these countries, what 20% of this amount would have provided in terms of extra education inputs. And these are not or, these are actually and, right? So in Ghana, the estimated tax loss to harmful tax incentive is 1.2 billion. So 20% of this could be 240 million. And this could have paid for extra school places for all children currently out of school, for an extra 10,000 additional qualified teachers, plus school meals for 1 year for 557,892. In Kenya, the estimated tax loss is 1.1 billion. And again, it could have paid for extra school places for all children that are currently out of school, 10,000 additional teachers, plus school meals for a year for over 300,000 children. In Uganda, this estimated tax loss is 370 million US dollars. And this could have paid again for extra school places for all the current children out of school in primary, and 20,000 additional qualified teachers and free school meals for each year for 412,000 children. As I said, these are the new fact sheets that were actually released in April. And in Nepal, the estimate for the tax incentives, and I would like to add the caveat that that Liz already mentioned, that it is quite difficult to find this data because it's not publicly available, which is one of our demands. So in Nepal, it's 1.68 billion US dollars, and 20% of this amount could have covered not only for school places for all the out-of-school children in primary and lower secondary, but also for the basic salary for 5,000 primary and 5,000 lower secondary teachers, and preschool meals for 600,000 children per year. And it would also expand the annual scholarship for vulnerable groups, an additional of 1 million young people, and the estimated annual financing gap in the Nepalese school sector development plan. So you can see that in Nepal, that will give you a lot more. In Senegal, you would have 1.119 billion in terms of the global tax abuse. I'm not going to go through everything because I am aware that we are already going out of time, but I would really like to invite you all to have a look at our fact sheets. So I'm just going to go for the specific reforms that we are advocating for. One of them, as I mentioned, is to increase the 4 S's of the education budget. So the share, size, sensitivity, and scrutiny of the budget. Also to increase the understanding between the Ministers of Finance and the Ministers of Education, to join forces with other public services, to not accept public sector wage bill constraints, to not spend more than 12% of the budget on the repayment services, to fight against privatization and commodification of education and other public services, and other reforms that they have already been mentioned in terms of not increasing the VAT, which is highly regressive, but to tax wealth and capital instead, to review, cancel, and stop giving tax incentives and double tax agreements, to demand transparency and accountability and compliance using the ABC that Liz had already mentioned, to demand debt cancellation, and to support the UN tax body, the Global Asset Register, and other FACTI panel and ICRIT recommendations. So thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing and introduce the new speaker, who is, right.
Me.
Because when you have this, yeah, it's you. So go ahead. Yeah. So this is David Archer from ActionAid, please.
Thanks very much, Maria. And I mean, in a sense, all of the specific reforms that you just outlined are things that we're trying to get embodied in what I think is the highest profile global education meeting for a generation at least, which is the Transforming Education Summit happening in New York in September, with all heads of state convened by the Secretary General. And we're putting forward a transformative agenda on the financing of education. I'm acting as a convener on the finance track feeding into that. And so we're putting squarely on the global education agenda with heads of state the urgent need for action on tax, the urgent need for action on debt, the urgent need for action against austerity, the urgent need for action in relation to public sector wage bill constraints, and in shifting of mindsets. I think it's an incredibly good opportunity to get some a radical reframing for the way in which the education community talks about financing, and to get consensus from heads of state. We had a pre-summit last week in Paris, and I think there's incredibly strong support from the ministers of education around the world for putting forward this quite bold financing agenda. And hopefully it can accelerate action in these other areas, at least add momentum to the need for action on a UN tax convention, on urgent need for debt renegotiation processes, and so on. Now, I'm going to focus particularly on austerity because, the recent global austerity alert estimates that the vast majority of the population of the planet will be living under austerity conditions by the end of this year. And possibly more acutely than at any other time, because after the temporary increases in spending during the COVID era, there is a sort of cult of obsessively returning to austerity, shared between the International Monetary Fund and ministries of finance. Now, we've been pushing back on that, and last year produced a report called The Public versus Austerity, together with Public Services International and Education International and ActionAid. And in a sense, we looked very, very in detail at the one flagship policy of austerity that most dramatically affects the financing of public services, and that is the imposition of public sector wage bill constraints. Because these policies directly block the recruitment of new teachers, nurses, and other frontline public sector workers, and hold down often the very poor pay and conditions of those who are already in place, perpetuating low pay. Our report shows that the imposition of these public sector wage bill constraints is probably one of the single biggest obstacles to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that there's a profound gendered impact as well, because when you hold down spending on public services, you're both, the first groups to be excluded from public services are women and girls. The burden of unpaid care and domestic work rises when public services fail, and actually some of the best opportunities for decent work for women in frontline services are diminished when there's a failure to invest in the public sector workforce. Our calculations showed in detailed studies across 15 countries that just as a result of the IMF advice to ministries of finance in those countries over a sustained period, that at least $10 billion have been removed from the public sector wage bill, which was the equivalent to 3 million frontline public sector workers just in those 15 countries. And whenever we challenge the IMF on this, they always say, oh, these are only ever used as a short-term temporary measure. We actually found that that was absolutely just not true, that every single country had been recommended to impose wage bill constraints for multiple years, and many for over 5 or 6 years. One of the things which became really shocking was that there really is no logic or rationale for when public sector wage bill constraints are recommended. If you look at the public sector wage bill as a percentage of GDP, it may have been coherent that a country like Zimbabwe, which was spending 17% of its GDP on the public sector wage bill, might be advised to freeze or cut. But the same was true for Liberia, that spends 10%, Ghana that spends 8%, Senegal that spends 6% of its GDP on the public sector wage bill, Brazil 4.6%, Nepal 3%, Uganda spending 3% of its GDP on public sector wage bill, told to freeze or cut that. And even Nigeria that spends just 1.9% of its GDP on public sector wage bill. So in whatever scenario, and what we found was that the IMF, in consultation with the ministries of finance, was systematically recommending in every single country that they should cut their public sector wage bill as a percentage of GDP below the regional average and below global averages. So there really was a failure of, the lack of evidence. The IMF used all sorts of random, dodgy bits of data comparison with countries who were always spending less, never looking at countries where public sector wage bill had increased. one of the things which is really clear is when, if there are always alternatives, and the question is the IMF advancing those alternatives? One of the key reports of the IMF, which talks about, perhaps for the first time in 2019, how can you finance the Sustainable Development Goals? One of the centerpiece policies there is that it estimates that most countries could expand their tax to GDP ratios by 5 percentage points in the medium term. So certainly between now and 2030, most low-income countries could raise their tax to GDP ratios from the present average of 16% to 21%. And we figured out that if countries did that and were able to expand their tax to GDP ratios at that rate, they could double their spending on education, and they could double their spending on health, and they could double their spending on social protection in most countries. So expanding the tax to GDP ratio can be transformative. Clearly, in a context where there is a cost of living crisis pretty much around the world, that has to be done through progressive tax reforms. We've shown in a number of studies how that can be achieved through progressive tax reforms that look at the whole of the tax system and the progressivity and the gender responsiveness of the tax system. The problem is that the IMF, despite producing a beautiful report on this at a global level, then never, and we had almost no evidence that the IMF recommended or advised or encouraged countries to expand tax to GDP ratios, certainly not using progressive tax reforms. So they weren't presenting alternatives. Faced with a lack of fiscal space, rather than seeking to expand that space through a bold action on tax, they just systematically recommend cuts to the public sector wage bill and therefore directly contradict the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. There was never any evidence of them doing impact assessment, either in advance or as a consequence of the advice that they were providing. And one of the weirdest things we found was that countries were told to cut social spending in order to increase social spending, which sounds completely contradictory and sort of is, but what the IMF mean by that is cut your spending of the recurrent costs and you can increase your social spending on capital costs and one-off costs. So that's very incoherent when you're talking about education, because the single largest cost in education, in fact, over 75% of the country, of the budget on education anywhere is on public sector wage bills, is on teachers effectively. Often it's over 90%. You cannot effectively expand spending on education if you don't expand spending on teachers. And what happens with this sort of infrastructure fundamentalism of the IMF is it diverts funds away from recurring costs into capital costs, and you find that actual capital costs are a much smaller part of education budgets and of health budgets. So you in fact divert resources away from health and education. That's the consequence. So we've been pushing back and saying that education and the core workforce in education and health ought to be seen as a part of the core infrastructure of the country to be protected even at the time of recessions. I know I've got a very limited amount of time, but I want to say that one of the things that we're trying to do now is take this debate directly to the IMF at the highest level. We've been engaging with Kristalina Georgieva, trying to drag her, screaming and kicking if necessary, to the Transforming Education Summit in New York at the end of September to make commitments and to recognize that the policies of the IMF, perhaps more than anybody else, profoundly shape the financing available for education. So if we're going to have a debate about the strategic financing of education worldwide, it is madness that the IMF is never at the table. Literally, the IMF is never at the table when it comes to discussions about education. I've been in God knows how many meetings over the last 30 years, international gatherings on education, every single UN gathering, all sorts of international meetings. The IMF is never there. And yet they are the ones who shape the resources that are available to invest in education, and likewise with health. We've got to bring them to the table and make them recognize the contradictions between their policy and their advice and the impact on the Sustainable Development Goals as a whole, and particularly on education and health. I think we might make a breakthrough, because there's such a contradiction between some of the progressive stuff that's being produced in their headquarters by their policy and research teams and the failure to deliver that advice in practice at country level. So if we can expose this and say, actually, we're just saying we agree with what you've been analysing and saying at global level, but you've got to start translating that into practice at country level. And that's how you'll unleash resources for the financing of public services. And that is action on tax. It does need action on debt as well, but urgently it needs to be to move away from this shrinking cult of austerity, which has really got adherents only left in the IMF and in ministries of finance around the world, and a revolving door between them, because most academic economists would move away from that understanding and actually look at all sorts of alternatives, and particularly in the light of COVID and the climate crisis. So I think we are actually at a cusp of, at a moment when we can achieve much more radical change than we have for a generation. And I think if we all work together across different constituencies, and particularly the coming together of the tax and fiscal justice movements and the public service movements, we can make a breakthrough. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. And now we will be handing the word, the floor, to Dennis Sinyolo from Education International, who will be the last panelist. And then we will be having perhaps a little bit of time for one or two questions, but I would like to encourage you to keep asking questions, particularly using the Q&A or perhaps the chat. Dennis, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Yes, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. We all know that teachers matter. Every child deserves a qualified teacher. That's how we're going to achieve SDG4, and that's how we're going to improve the quality of our education systems. But as we know from UNESCO data, it's not that easy. 69 million new teachers are needed to achieve SDG4 by 2030. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, we have a critical shortage of teachers. 15 million new teachers will be needed to achieve SDG4 by 2030. And even among those teachers that we have in the system, only 50% of secondary school teachers are trained according to national standards. So that's what UNESCO data shows us. You can see that there is a serious challenge in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the quality of teachers that we have. But where is the problem? The problem is, first and foremost, the policy advice of international financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. For example, through structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and 90s, many African governments were told class size does not matter. Even if you have students of up to 60 in a class, the quality of learning will be the same as a smaller class. And that devastating policy advice allowed many of our governments in Africa, for example, to recruit less and less teachers because class size didn't matter, but we know that it does a great deal. You cannot meet the individual needs of students unless you attend to them, to those needs, and that can only happen if the class is smaller. And then, of course, part of the policy advice was that teacher training did not matter. And many African countries, you can't believe it, actually closed their teacher training colleges because they were advised it didn't matter. Even if you are trained or not trained, the results are the same. But we know that it does matter. In fact, those people who are giving that kind of policy advice would not like their own child to be taught by an unqualified individual. Certainly, how many of you would allow any untrained or unqualified doctor to operate on you? I believe none. It is the same thing with our children. It's only that the consequences of an unqualified medical professional are immediate, but the consequences of an unqualified or untrained individual working with our children are long-term. And they may not be visible immediately, but they're really long-term and may affect young people for the rest of their lives. That's why every child needs a qualified teacher. But these conditionalities, these lending conditions of the IMF, the World Bank, have a devastating impact on our education systems. Yes, I was talking about the policies of the World Bank mainly, as well as the IMF in the past. What about the present? Yes, as we've heard, we have the same challenges today. Education International collaborated with ActionAid and carried out a study in Nepal, in Malawi, Zambia, and Senegal. The evidence is the same as we've been hearing this afternoon, this morning, depending on where you are. It is clear the IMF continues to give policy advice to governments, sometimes even to be explicit, to give lending conditions, curtailing what they call the wage bill. This is the public sector wage bill, basically. And in many countries, of course, the majority of public sector workers are teachers. So if you're going to put a ceiling on public expenditure, on the public sector wage bill, we are practically putting a ceiling on teacher salaries. You're curtailing the ability of countries to train and recruit more teachers. For example, in Nepal in 2020, the IMF advised the government to freeze the public sector wage bill to 2.9% of gross domestic product. In Malawi, the country borrowed some money from the rapid credit facility of the IMF, and the IMF immediately called upon the country to freeze the wage bill at 7.5% of GDP. In Zambia, the IMF advised the government to cut the public sector wage bill by 1% between 2016 and 2023 in order to meet a target of 7.7% of GDP. Now you can see that there is a problem here. How do we respond to this? I think we've had very, very good recommendations being put forward. But let me start from the basics. Governments are not meeting the target of 20% of the national budget being invested in education. Even where they are, this is still very small. Remember, that's the minimum. Sometimes there is an attempt globally and nationally to actually reduce that into a lower ambition of, instead of the minimum being 20 for developing countries, which was actually the spirit of the agreement, but the minimum being reduced to actually 15% or 4% of GDP. Let's remember to stick to those minimum benchmarks for developing countries, 20% and 6%. Governments are not meeting that. I was looking at data from UNESCO. It's very clear. Domestic financing of education has fallen from 14.1% in 2019 to 13.5% in 2021. In fact, all the gains made in the last decade have been wiped out, mainly because of COVID. And now, of course, we have the conflict in Ukraine and other crises that are affecting our countries, particularly in developing countries, whether you're talking about conflict, climate change, or others. So this is a serious problem. So first of all, countries need actually to invest in domestic financing of education and to meet those minimum benchmarks. That is very basic. And developed countries need to honor the commitment to invest or allocate 0.7% of gross national income to development aid. And at least 10% of all development aid should go to education. Currently, it's only 2.5%. If that were to be increased, it would support many countries, especially those that are in conflict areas. That's why it's important to continue to support the Global Partnership for Education. And education cannot wait, which actually will be having its financing conference in February next year. And of course, international financial institutions should desist from imposing their negative conditionalities, especially austerity, on developing countries. This is a problem. And in fact, developing countries should also have the courage to say no. Unfortunately, quite often they don't. So it's very important. So as Education International, as teachers of the world, will continue to collect evidence and to put pressure on international financial institutions to allow education to breathe, because our education systems can't breathe at the moment. I will end by saying, let's remember that every child needs a qualified teacher, a well-trained teacher, and a teacher with decent salaries and working conditions. Remember that every child can only thrive and succeed and achieve their potential in that environment where they have a qualified professional supporting them. So let's improve the working conditions of teachers. By so doing, improving the learning conditions of our students. that we can achieve by pushing back on the negative and austerity policies of international financial institutions. Thanks. Back to you, Maria.
Thank you, Dennis. Great ending of our panel, really powerful. So we have a question or two, and I think that, as I said, feel free to type them in the, oh, David, there was a specific question for you. I don't know whether you would like to.
I did actually answer it online, which is to say it's part of the UN General Assembly, so all states should be there. It's not like a UN Summit of the Americas where the US control the agenda. This is supposed to be at the UN, but who knows?
Perfect. I didn't see any more questions being asked, I don't think, but I would now like to ask each of the panelists to have a specific call to action for the high-level political forum. And we are going to be following the order of the presentations. So we will be starting with you, Attiya, if that's okay.
I will take 1 minute to say that it is extremely crucial that rights are connected to resources at a very broad level, and that this particular call is embedded throughout all the conversations that are going on through the high-level panel, and that it is really important from a resource perspective that we set up an international tax body, a fiscal body, that the debt achievements from the Addis Ababa action agenda are not lost, and we don't take a step backwards, but we move forward on debt, but that we also move forward on tax and other issues. And from a human rights perspective, specifically education, that the financing of the public sector of education across the world is absolutely critical and does need to be linked into this. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Attiya. So we will go now for Liz. What's your call to action?
Thanks, Maria. Yeah, I think I would say to the high-level political forum, the UN Convention on Tax is needed now. It's come of age, if you like, and it's very much about raising standards, about progressivity, about transparency, about gender justice, about inclusivity, and transparency, and there was a raising of standards are really key about that, and to ask, you know, when you're thinking at a high-level political forum that the need is to raise revenue, think about, is the solution for that revenue, you know, is it sustainable, will it be transparent, and will it provide the inclusivity and the legitimacy that it needs. And I suppose the last thing I would say is talk to civil society, because reach out to us, because not just that we've got a lot to say, we've got a lot of expertise and experience and on the ground information that can inform your decisions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Liz. Bernie, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I would say that we need, as others have said, a UN Convention on Tax. I think this will curtail losses. I think it'll reduce debt service, and governments will have more domestic resources to spend. In terms of expenditure, as we've heard, we need to spend more, and we need to really push back against IMF austerity, which comes on the back of tax losses and debt service. When we spend on education, that promotes health. It promotes increased, a better educated workforce, which promotes economic growth and increased government revenue. It's a virtuous circle. We just have to find that one intervention point. And I believe it's a UN Convention on Tax. In the meantime, I think governments should be looking at their own policies, and advocates in the West should continue to ask their governments to review their policies in terms of policy coherence for sustainable development. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bernie. David, over to you.
I thought you were going to go next, but you should have the final word. So yes, I mean, I think a lot of what we're talking about is about decolonizing the whole understanding of the financing agenda, recognizing that, you know, the world is not going to be saved by another little pot of money in some sort of international aid budget. Look, the Global Partnership for Education cannot wait, play an important role, but this is peanuts. The structural systemic change is in the international order. We don't need a new international aid pot. We need international action to unblock domestic financing through tax justice, debt justice, and action on austerity. The international community is doing more harm than good at the time, and let's not get them away, let them get away with the idea that by creating some sort of little pot of money somewhere they can assuage their conscience. That's not what we're about. We're about a system change, and that is pretty fundamental. And you know, we are living in a world of neo-colonial relations where the IMF and the World Bank are still perpetuating a world order that really should have disappeared immediately after the Second World War, and certainly after the independence of most African nations. It's astonishing that we are still fundamentally working with the same international economic order that was in place when most of Africa was under colonial rule. It's madness, and that's why we're caught in a world in which the interests of powerful countries in the north overwhelmingly dominate what's happening, and we've got to change that. That's the biggest systemic change.
Thank you very much, David. So Dennis, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. For the Transforming Education Summit, the United Nations, I mean our governments, should ensure a qualified teacher for every child. A qualified teacher for every child. That's fundamental. But how can that be possible? Of course, make teaching an attractive and first choice profession, and #1 profession for everyone, not a stepping stone to something else, or not teaching because, oh, I can't do something else. Make it #1 by improving the status and working conditions of teachers, for example, by providing the autonomy, the support that is needed for teachers to do what they know best, to teach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and no pressure for the final words. But what I would like to call in terms of action is trying to summarize some of the stuff that has been shared, is to say that those committing or enabling tax abuse are committing or enabling human rights violations. When we are talking about public services, we are also talking about human rights. This is serious, okay? This is not just an accountant, just like changing some figures here and there. This is actually like resulting in human rights violation, in children dying, in children not being able to access schools, in mothers not being able to access health facilities. This is life-changing, okay? So this is very serious. Again, without revenue, rights cannot be guaranteed. So it's in the interest of everyone to be there, particularly head of states, particularly ministers of education, ministers of finance. Everyone needs to take this seriously and to try to understand it the best they can. We need feminist progressive taxation, and this should be seen as a solution for financing SDGs. No ODA, no more debt, okay? Just let's start thinking about outside the shared budget box, okay? We really need to increase the sizes of the size of the government budget. Again, overseas development aid is not only reproducing some of the colonization from before, but all these conditionalities are really affecting the way that public services can be provided, the way that we can guarantee human rights. And as Bernie clearly showed, ODA is very small in comparison to the potential tax revenue that could be mobilized if we are serious about tackling international financial flows. So I would like to encourage us all to take this message forward, because there are solutions. There are really solutions for to achieving the sustainable development goals. It's not that they are too ambitious, okay? It's that the people who are behind all these interests are making it very difficult for the revenue to be there. So I would like to again thank this excellent panel for bringing all this new perspective, and also actionable solutions to the problems that we are facing. And thank you very much, especially also to Lais, to be able to set up everything to make this panel possible. And I was wondering whether there would be any chance to actually copy some of the links and the resources that have been shared on the chat, so the people who are watching it later in YouTube can also access those. So thank you very much again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of the high-level political forum.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everyone.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.